Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm hoping you can hear me. So if you can, please type in the chat. If you can hear me, I'll give you a few seconds. I know the picture's a little blurry. That's the webcam on this particular computer. It won't have any effect on the PowerPoint presentation, but hopefully we can get started. Oh, hi, Orly. There we go. Somebody can hear me. Ashton says working, yay. Helen says I can hear you. Okay. Pamela says hi. See, everybody's so friendly. That's so nice. Lucia says good evening. Jay says hello. Looking forward to hearing this webinar. Everybody says loud and clear. Can hear me. Hi, Carol, Lori, etc. Okay. All right, we'll get started. I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint. And so we'll get started. And just waiting for that. No, I didn't do that right. What did I do? Turn off screen share. Cancel. There we go. Try this again. Click that. Click that. All right. No, still me. Why is that? No, that didn't work either. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Hi, Luana. I am having technical difficulties. All right, let's try this again. Cancel that. Go in here. Do this. This. I'm not saying anything, Jay. That might be why you have no sound. I don't know why the screen share is not coming up. That's a first. That is a first. And I don't know what to do. Well, maybe it's coming. Oh, there it is. Yay. Okay. I don't know what I did right, and I don't know what I did wrong. Do not like that. Usually things are supposed to work the way they're supposed to work. But anyway, okay, so we're good to go. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so we're going to be talking about different gut connections to autism tonight, and this is tricky. It's very frustrating for me when I talk about gut work, because when I listen to other practitioners talk about it, I can tell they don't understand how multifaceted it is. And maybe it's just the nature of the way we do things, where things have to be, gotten into some kind of formula, call it a protocol if you like. But what I'm seeing from gut work, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way at all. The gut bacteria is multifaceted. It is far more complex than our bodies. So when we start talking about the different species and strains, there's so many of them. They are all kind of unique, and we're unique, and it just doesn't formulate into something that's simple. Any connections to, of course, autism or any other factors that we might have towards autism are going to be multifaceted as well. And often they may overlap, but underlying is a gut connection. So, for example, I talk about this a little bit later. You know, a lot of times people with autism have liver issues and they don't detox well. And if, you know, if people understand gut, then they would know that there's a connection to why people don't detox well when they have dysbiosis. So those two things overlap, and you may see both gut problems and liver problems in someone with autism. But underneath, you can usually trace it back to something to do with the gut. So there's a lot of different aspects to this. And I'm not trying to, you know, obviously I don't know everything about this because it's not known yet. There's so much about the gut that's not known. So I'm just going to share with you what we know now, and then maybe that might help in some connection with whatever or whoever you're working with. Okay, so just some basic autism information. Probably you know this. So back in the 50s, it was only common with 1 in 10,000 people. Now it's 1 in 68 persons. And it doesn't matter, you know, what kind of guide or definition you want to use, that's incredible. In the past, they would have considered it just a genetic situation at numbers like 1 in 10,000. That was the go-to kind of answer. But now you cannot ignore that something has to have changed, right? To go from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 68 people, that's a big, big difference. And so something's clearly changed. It affects more males than females. Some of the things it's characterized by is abnormal social interaction or fixation with objects. There may be speech and language difficulties. There are repetitive stereotype movements. Sometimes an autistic person can be injuring themselves or have impulsive behavior. There is a lot of sensitivity to sound and touch and sight. Some, it's very rare, have savant syndrome. They often have restricted interests. Many are picky eaters and crave carbs in particular. And there's 2 comorbidities. One is seizure disorder, and interesting enough, it's gastrointestinal dysfunction. So I find it funny they consider that a comorbidity when more than likely the gastrointestinal dysfunction came first. So as I said, it's a very tricky topic because of the increase in incidence of autism. We have to look at the gut because we've seen increased gut issues that are occurring. So that's also been documented. And now we've also seen that gut issues are linked to many conditions, and they're especially the conditions where we've seen an increase. So for example, allergies. So it's not just autism, allergies has increased dramatically, Alzheimer's, diabetes type 2, all of these have established gut connections. And so it shouldn't be surprising that we can look in this direction for autism. The thing to remember is every autistic person is different. So I rhymed off, you know, some typical conditions or issues that may occur with an autistic person, but it doesn't mean it happens with all of them. And I think that's a really important point, that there is no sort of one face of autism. It manifests in many different ways with different symptoms. And yes, there are often some similar symptoms seen in a certain percentage, but they're all unique. And this makes perfect sense because no 2 guts are the same. So no 2 autistic persons will develop the condition in the same way. Guts are like fingerprints. They're all unique. So hopefully that makes it easier to understand why they can't find a smoking gun, but it doesn't mean we can't help in some fashion. So what research is doing is looking for factors. And I have 2 questions with regard to whatever they're researching and whatever they find. So obviously the first one would be what factors could lead to the development of autism. I think that's something that we need to understand If there's things we can do differently in the future, that's great. But the second one is what improvements can occur once the condition is present. And that's the issue facing most people who have a family member with autism, is the autism is there. It's not a question of what factors led to it. It's only a question, are those factors still contributing to issues, or how capable is the brain of remodeling with intervention? So we don't know what kind of permanency any of the issues an autistic person may have. We don't know how permanent they are, and it's going to vary for each autistic person. It's all going to be different. So the question then becomes is, is something permanent? So something in the brain has been changed or altered permanently, or can interventions allow the brain to change itself again or adapt? So those are the kind of questions I think are important to consider when we're looking at autism and what we might be able to do with someone. And I'm just going to check back in and make sure you're all okay. All right, so Jay's still having problems. That's weird, Jay, because you're in the chat. So hopefully you figured that out. If not, I mean, this is being recorded, so the replay will come out to you. So these systems, they're all quirky. Okay, let me go back to the PowerPoint. All right. Okay, so a lot of the research right now is looking at altered gut microflora as the key to understanding this disorder. So we've talked about this in the past with other health conditions where they're not just looking at a ratio of good bacteria to bad bacteria, they're looking at specific strains of what we'll call pathogenic bacteria, for lack of a better name, and are they more prevalent with certain health conditions. They've found some for diabetes, they've found some for multiple sclerosis, they found some for a number of conditions that if you have more of these, they seem to be in higher numbers in people with MS or diabetes or whatever. So this is where they're going. This is where a lot of the research is going. And the difference is the pathology of something like diabetes is well understood, whereas it's not with autism. So they don't really know the process where a brain changes so that the person will be diagnosed with autism, versus they do know what will happen, with blood sugar and the pancreas and insulin sensitivity and things like that. So they know that. So there's a lot to sort of try and sort out. Autistic kids definitely have altered gut microflora, so that has been looked at quite a bit. If you want to call it dysbiosis, we'll just call it that. And autism has been linked to an excess of pathogenic bacteria creating metabolites that alter the brain-gut connection and brain function. And we'll talk a little bit about metabolites in a second. But both good and bad bacteria produces metabolites, and some metabolites are good, like butyrate, and some of them are not so good, like LPS. And so this is when they enter into the bloodstream, they can do things in the rest of the body, including the brain, and so this is why they're looking at the metabolites. Autistic kids have an altered ratio of glutamate and glutamine. So they have more glutamate than glutamine. And normally you have more glutamine than glutamate. So glutamate, which is also known as glutamic acid, enters into the system. You can make it as well, but we get a lot of it from food. So things like cabbage and beets have glutamic acid, not glutamine. They have glutamic acid. And then your gut bacteria converts glutamic acid to glutamine. And so this glutamine thing is regulated in the gut. And obviously, if someone has dysbiosis, they may not make enough glutamine depending on what bacteria is involved and what bacteria they have or don't have. A rat study found a connection to prenatal exposure to LPS. So LPS stands for lipopolysaccharide, and it's probably the most well-studied metabolite that is produced by pathogenic bacteria. And they found that it would lead to autism-like effects such as social issues, cognitive inflexibility, and communication issues. So again, you can't just say LPS because LPS is a factor in many health conditions, not just autism. LPS also lowers glutathione levels, which is important for detoxing heavy metals. And of course, there has been suggestions that many children with autism are not successful at detoxing out heavy metals as well as typically would be done with other people. So this brings in the liver conversation, and I don't really want to talk about vaccinations, but if there was anything that we could point to as might being a factor is if when the children were getting vaccinated with vaccinations that contain mercury, and I believe they also contain aluminum. I don't know if they've taken the aluminum out. I think they've taken the mercury out. If they didn't detox it out successfully like most people do when they get a vaccination, again, it could be a factor. So that's all I'm going to say about vaccination. Okay, so there have been correlations between gut bacteria and neurotransmitter metabolites. So we know that the brain and the gut are talking to each other all the time. This is a current focus of research for autistic people, but they still don't know the specific mechanics. All right, now, bacterial metabolites, we've talked about that. And again, what they find is dysbiosis is present in autistic persons. So I think I mentioned this before, when you have a more symbiotic relationship with good and bad bacteria, you get beneficial metabolites, many of which can cancel out pathogenic bacteria metabolites. So dysbiosis is a major factor. They are also finding there is more incidence of opportunistic infections such as Clostridia. As a matter of fact, Clostridia is one of the strains or types of bacteria. I shouldn't say strains because there's many different types of Clostridia strains, but it's one of the species that they're looking at as possibly being in excess with regard to autism. And of course, yeast, Candida albicans in particular. They're also looking to see if they've had chronic antibiotics. But again, maybe, in some people, one antibiotic can do things and cause some changes that are not ideal that can lead to bigger problems. Whereas with other people, it might take several courses. So again, you can't even just say chronic antibiotics. It could be just one in some cases, or none. I'm sure there are people who are having autism that haven't had a course of antibiotics, and that's a whole other subject. And then, of course, the LPS, which we've been talking about, damages the cell wall, if you want to call it, makes it leaky, and allows LPS to go into the bloodstream and up to the brain and do things, as well as, go to the liver and interfere with the liver. And it would be there would be other metabolites that might not be ideal also doing this at the same time. And of course, how well do they produce short-chain fatty acids? So when you consume dietary carbohydrates, your bifidus bacteria in your colon makes short-chain fatty acids, but you have to have the right ones. Butyrate in particular is quite beneficial. So they may not have enough so that when they eat the carbohydrates, they're not A, digesting them properly, and B, getting the short-chain fatty acids. So this could be a factor. And then, of course, there's gut lining issues. So what is their mucus lining like? What is their epithelial lining like? Do they have, and this was where genetics may play a role with regard to gut, were any anomalies occurring with the gut lining, as part of, the process of them being formed as a baby in the womb. We don't know. We don't know if that happens that soon or that early. And then the big thing is the dose and timing of exposure. So a lot of these things we're talking about, you and I as adults can be exposed to these things and we don't develop autism, but our brains are not developing. So how much of what they got of any of these factors and the timing of when it occurred are what they consider playing a role in the development of autism. So there is a lot of digestive system issues in those who have autism. Initially, it was poorly studied, but now there's been a renewed interest, especially with new technology, and there are a number of researchers who are trying to sort of put pieces together with that regard. And when they look at autism, they look at people who have autism in subsets. So each type of problem that could be linked to autism is put into a subset category, and a different, like one autistic person could have, a certain set of subsets, and then another one could have different ones, or they could overlap in a bit, but they always kind of categorize it as a subset. So we'll see where that goes, what they're learning about what's actually going on in the intestines. They have associated regressive onset autism. So this is the one that occurs later with GI symptoms. And they often see impaired carbohydrate digestion, inflammation, unique bacteria, like in terms of sometimes strains, sometimes species, sometimes how much of a given species. And they also have noted carbohydrate craving in, again, a subset of autistic patients. So these factors that we've been talking about, they are occurring while the brain is growing. And they also have noted that autistic kids have reduced carnitine levels because antibiotics deplete it. They have low levels of methyl B12. They can have poor glutathione metabolism, which is going to, again, interfere with detoxification, especially heavy metals. And this is the metabolism of glutathione from converting N-acetylcysteine, or NAC. And of course, they found they have higher LPS, and LPS is found in the outer membrane of gram-negative bacteria and elicits a very strong immune response. So inflammation would be occurring because of high LPS. And again, this would include the brain, and this is not a good thing while the brain is growing. Now, this is another metabolite they just discovered. It's 4-ethylphenyl sulfate, and it's produced by gut bacteria similar to other chemicals, the way LPS is produced, and it's found at higher level in autistic children. And there's another one called P-cresol that's also found. So they're starting to identify more of these metabolites produced by gut bacteria, pathogenic gut bacteria, that can be causing issues. And when mice with autistic symptoms, and I have to say that a lot of the research on autism, especially when they're playing with gut bacteria or what's going on in the gut, is done on rodents. But anyway, so mice with autistic symptoms have 40 times more 4-EPS than non-autistic mice. So that's extremely high. And so this may be a factor similar to LPS and other metabolites. And then, of course, the exposure to infections, antibiotics, dysbiosis has led to more Clostridium. And Clostridium produces a higher level of propionate. Now, this is a short-chain fatty acid, and we do need some propionate. It's not a bad thing at the right level, but high levels are not. And this is one of the things that's being looked at with regard to autism. Propionate can affect cell-to-cell communication, and this is really important when you're forming synapses, which of course is what's happening when the brain is developing. So normally, as I said, we make it. It's part of our colon short chain fatty acids, but it's also used as a preservative. It's usually written calcium propionate or sodium propionate. And it basically prevents bacteria from producing energy. It inhibits mold and bacteria. And both calcium propionate and sodium propionate have been linked to gastritis, so stomach issues. And in rodent studies, it produced reversible behavior changes. So they've done some studies where they gave rats propionic acid to observe what happened to them. And they found that they became more hyperactive. They had dystonia, so muscle spasms and posture issues. And they are connecting that was possible with the repetitive movement that is often seen in autistic persons. Neuroinflammation, glutathione depletion, social impairment, and repetitive behavior. And this is being done by Dr. Derek McFab, who's a neuroscientist and director at the Kylie Patchell Evans Autism Research Group in Western University. So he's done a number of studies looking at propionate to see how it affects rats. And this is just one picture. This is a shot taken from a video that if you ever see him talk on this subject, he has videos of the different experiments they've done with propionate. And so in this particular one, you can see before the two rats were being very social, and then after they got the propionic acid, they are no longer together. And I've seen the actual video. This goes on for quite a while. It's not like the rat ran around once and then went back to the other rat. No, he just stayed away. And they've done this with observing other things that are common symptoms when people have autism. So it wasn't just their social behavior that was affected. Other things were affected as well. And again, it's the time of exposure of excess propionic acid that's critical. So if the brain is developing, this is when it's going to have a more damaging effect. Autistic kids naturally produce more propionate, so they are more prone to this. Now, whether this is because they have more Clostridium strains and they have dysbiosis, not really known, probably, or it could be other bacteria as well that also produces more propionate. Don't know that yet, but they do tend to have more. It's also, as I mentioned, a preservative, and it's used in bread, dairy products, and sprayed on fruits. Interestingly, when broad-spectrum antibiotics are given temporarily, autistic symptoms improve. And that's not the first time I've heard that with other health conditions too. I've had many people come up to me and tell me that they went on antibiotics and they felt a lot better for whatever they had been suffering from for quite some, and that wasn't the reason they went on the antibiotics. They went on the antibiotics because they had some infection of some kind and they felt better in general. And that makes perfect sense, because if these symptoms are being caused by bad bacteria while you're on the antibiotics, they're being kept down in numbers. And that would be a good indicator that perhaps the changes in the brain aren't necessarily as permanent as they could be, because these things happened, when the brain was developing, that there's still, room for some interventions. So that I found that was very interesting. Inulin and resistant starch can produce more butyrate. So that's another short chain fatty acid. Resistant starch is found in grains and potatoes and bananas and legumes. Inulin is found in different fruits and vegetables. And basically your bifidus bacteria can help you produce more butyrate. The problem is you have to have sufficient bifidus bacteria for this to occur. So this is why when you're dealing with a situation like that, you have to remember that if they have dysbiosis, the pathogenic bacteria has more of an advantage than it should. And just trying to deal with the beneficial bacteria and trying to make it grow may not be enough because of this relationship. Okay. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. I'm just looking here. Luana says this is good to know because my son started getting worse as he entered his 20s. Well, that's very interesting. It'd be interesting to see if what changed or if anything changed when that occurred, Luana. All right, I will go back to this. Oops, where'd it go? Come back. There we go. Still there, yes. Okay, so I put this up here. This is actually, some of these slides are from Healthy Gut, and I have this in Healthy Gut because, again, this is 100% whole wheat. If this was white flour, it would say the same thing, but just to show you, people are buying Dempster's thinking, wow, it's whole wheat, it's great, it's wonderful, not white bread. But when you look at the ingredient list, first of all, there's a lot of other crap in it, like canola oil and soybean oil and esters of mono and triglycerides, but there's the calcium propionate. So, if they're already producing too much, plus depending on what their diet is like, they might be getting more from the diet. These are all things that we can look at when we're working with a client. Now, autistic children have lower levels of bifidus bacteria, as we've been discussing, and higher levels of pathogenic bacteria. But the other thing, and this is very important too, is they have less diversity of bacteria. And one of the things we've learned when they look at North American guts and compare them to, say, indigenous people in Africa who are still living pretty much the way they always lived, off the land and, exposed to a lot more of the outside world and dirt and things like that, is that we as a society have less diversity than we did even 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and then certainly a lot less than they're seeing with these communities in Africa. And then when we're looking at the autistic kids, they have even less than what normal North American has. So the less diversity is in comparison to typical North Americans, not Africans. So it's an even worse situation. And so, again, this is difficult because the building of the diversity happens at a very young age, up and right now, as far as we know, up to the age of 2. Now they're sort of starting to expand and say maybe it's 3. And we really don't know what kind of flexibility the gut has to build diversity later in life. We know that in animal studies, there seems to be a window at which point, once you're an adult, that ship has sailed. But again, we don't know because they really haven't tried to see if something, if one strain promotes new strains, or we don't know yet. And autistic kids have more fungus related issues, especially with Candida albicans. And this could contribute to the behavior issues. Plus, these organisms may be consuming nutrients that the body needs for proper function. So the quality of the nutrients, especially if the child isn't eating a really nutrient-dense diet, can be a factor too. Now, they just discovered that this particular bacteria, Bacteroides fragilis, is often lower in those with autism. And they transferred human Bacteroides fragilis into mice who displayed autistic-like symptoms, and the mice became less anxious, communicated more with other mice, and showed less repetitive behavior. So while they're working on discovering bacteria that may be contributing to the development of autism, they're also looking at bacteria that may counter what the symptoms of autism are. And I think they're going to be discovering more bacteria relationships like this. And that brings us to brain plasticity. So there's a lot of research going on in brain plasticity. And again, when we talk about what can be accomplished once someone has autism, how plastic the brain is something to think about. So all young mammals have a critical period where their brain can be remodeled, so they can make new neural connections, and they make them in response to different factors. So this is why this early period in a child's life is so important, that they receive the right nutrients and the right building blocks and stuff like that, not just for the gut, but for the brain as well. And once we're an adult, our brains are less plastic. So we do not, so far, remodel well as adults. So researchers recently found a set of molecules known as synaptic cell adhesion molecules, and they apparently control the mature brain. And when they removed them in animal models, it restored plasticity. So that sounds, promising, but they need to do a lot more research because they are looking at it for the remodeling of the brain for autism and stroke, but there could be other consequences. For example, an excess of these molecules is really good for spine density. So, again, this is not these molecules aren't bad. We have them for a reason. And they need to be careful. So they could be acting like, if they're helping with spine density, they could be helping us maintain our adult frame. It just happens that it also means our brains are no longer as flexible as they once were. The other thing I read, though, is that, one of the standards for autistic kids is to do brain training exercises. This is what they often get when they go to school. And what they feel is that these exercises help due to the plasticity of the brains of the children. Because their brains are still plastic, they, well, I shouldn't say plastic, but you know what I mean, still have plasticity, that they benefit from the brain having the ability to, if you want to call it, retrain itself. Now, autism does not create brain connectivity problems. It stems from an underdeveloped cerebral cortex, which of course is responsible for relaying interpreting messages. Other causes, such as protein synthesis issues or core brain area dysfunction, are also present. For example, a dysfunctional hypothalamus affects sleep, and this may be a role in the development of autism. And sleep issues are common amongst those who are autistic. They either have insomnia, have trouble falling asleep, have trouble staying asleep, have restless sleep, or they just don't sleep deep enough. And again, there's many reasons why that can be. There's a lot of things that affect sleep. So certainly the symptoms that they experience, especially the sensory ones, might be interfering with their sleep. If their hearing is so sensitive and the touch is so sensitive and such. The gut obviously affects sleep. If you have gut issues, it's been linked to gut sleep issue problems. So sleep is a really important consideration. And again, if you're working with someone, you should go through their sleep hygiene and try to figure out what might be going on if you can and what might help. Now, the good news is that gut bacteria is a modulator of brain plasticity. So most of the studies that have identified this have been focusing on the elderly. And again, with the elderly, they have the mature brain, and therefore their brain's not supposed to be plastic anymore. Or, you know what I mean. Anyway, so they are finding that certain strategies with gut bacteria is actually helping memory and things that you wouldn't expect would happen from a brain that is no longer has plasticity. So again, if it's going to help the elderly, it can possibly help autistic children as well, especially if their brains still have plasticity. When we look at the bacteria in younger persons versus older persons, there are more species in the older people that are linked to inflammation and harmful metabolites like LPS. And they found that strains such as Lactobacillus helvetica, Bifidobacterium longum, Lactobacillus rhamnosus, and Bifidobacterium breve all help with anxiety. So these are just, some of the connections they've made with the gut and the brain, and issues that stem from the nervous system and the brain. Now, BDNF stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and it actually regulates synaptic plasticity, also neuron development or differentiation, and survival of the neurons as well. And when they look at those who have autism, they find much lower levels of BDNF than would be typically found in most people. And the less BDNF they had, the more severe their symptoms. Now, our friend butyrate, the short-chain fatty acid, has been found to increase BDNF. And again, so you're seeing a pattern here. If they had enough bifidus bacteria, which they are typically not having as much as most would, that they aren't going to have enough butyrate. And if they don't have enough butyrate, they may not end up having enough BDNF, and that can be affecting the plasticity of the brain and some of the other elements that are going on in the brain as well. Consuming fiber, especially resistant starch. Another thing that's really good for butyrate is GOS, galacto-oligosaccharides. That is the #1 prebiotic that they know so far that babies should be getting to build their bifidus bacteria between the time they're born and they're 2 years old. And again, it is present in mother's milk. It is present in cow's milk. It is present in goat's milk. And now they're adding it to formulas. And they have done studies that show that when they add GOS to formulas, that the babies increase their bifidus rate around the same rate that a breastfed baby would be. And of course, there are supplements that have GOS in it as well that are coming out. So there's ways this could be a very helpful thing. There is, and I keep saying, and I probably shouldn't say it, Genestra has a butyrate supplement, but it's not been available for over a year now. I even asked at a seminar I went to when it was going to become available, and they didn't have an answer. So, but that would also be a possible answer when that comes back on the market, because in that way you know for sure they're getting the butyrate. Now, BSL-3 is a very well-studied and well-known high-dose probiotic, 450 billion. And it's no longer sold as BSL-3. It's now called Visabiome, so don't be looking for it as BSL-3. When you're looking at the research, you got to look at BSL-3. But the actual original formula is now under the name Visabiome. And they found significant changes in the gut microbiota composition and increased brain tissue expression of genes associated with inflammation and neuroplasticity, such as BDNF and synapsin, which is involved with neurotransmitter relief. So in other words, they've actually looked at BSL-3 or Visabiome to find that it is having an effect on the brain, which is good. Now, they also did a study of mice where they fed the mothers a high-fat diet and made them fat. And what they found was that the offspring had higher neurodevelopmental disorders, including autism. They also found a major shift in the microbial environment of the guts of the mothers who ate the high-fat diet. And they found that the bacteria strain Lactobacillus reuteri was able to correct oxytocin levels. So oxytocin level, which is the bonding chemical that we have, is often low in those with autism spectrum disorder. And and also the social deficits or social behavior issues, they found that this strain helped correct those. So again, this is in babies or young mice. We don't know if it would have that effect from a human perspective, but a Lactobacillus reuteri is not hard to find. Okay, so then the other issue, again, that is often present is liver function issues. So in particular, they've noticed that in some of those with autism, they have trouble with phase 2 of phase 1 and phase 2 liver detoxification. In particular, the phase 2 activities of sulfation, glucuronidation, and glutathione conjugation. Remember, glutathione conjugation would be the one involved with detoxing of heavy metals. And so this study, it was a meta-analysis study, so it looked at a whole bunch of studies, and they looked at cases of pesticides, phthalates, PCBs, mercury, other metals, solvents, air pollution, and they looked at the exposure to these things in preconception, gestational period, and then after in the child before they developed autism to see what they could discover. And they found that there were issues that they could link to autism as a result of these exposures. And I mentioned earlier that gut bacteria affects phase 1 and phase 2 liver detoxification. So LPS inhibits phase 1 and phase 2, whereas beneficial bacteria promote phase 1 and phase 2. So again, we're right back to the same thing. You've got dysbiosis, you've got to get rid of the dysbiosis, you've got to build up the good bacteria, or at least get good bacteria into them that can help do the work, or both. And so this isn't going to change that. This is important. Now, there's a three-way relationship between the gut, the brain, and cortisol. Cortisol is actually the key element. We know it's a hormone, but it's the key element that the gut and the brain use to talk to each other. So they did a study of piglets, whose brains are very similar to humans, and they found 4 different pathogenic species. Butyricomanosus, whatever. I had no problem pronouncing that earlier. Butyricomanosus, there we go. Clostridium, Bacteroides, and Ruminococcus were the families that they found in piglets that influenced the levels of serotonin and cortisol. So the more they had of this, the more it affected them. So autistic children often have higher levels of serotonin, but they metabolize it different, and it often makes the serotonin work in the opposite way it's supposed to work. So even, you would think high levels of serotonin would be very calming, but that's not the way it's working, the way they metabolize it. And lower functioning autistic children have higher levels of cortisol, and this is compared to high functioning autistic children and typical children. So it seems that the more cortisol there is, the more it lowers function. All right, so what do we have here? We have pieces, right? That's all we have. But I think there's enough pieces that we could create a potential preventative program for mothers prior to conception. However, we could never market that, because you could never market a program that says, prevent autism, because we don't know. We don't know it's going to prevent autism. But I think we can easily market to mothers a program that may prevent allergies, postpartum depression, other issues that mothers and babies often face during and after pregnancy, that we just know is good common sense. I think being more involved in educating women, because they're not getting it from their doctors, to take certain steps and looking at their gut before they get pregnant, because you can do a lot more before they're pregnant than you can when they are pregnant or breastfeeding. So I think there's a lot we can do to educate, which I think could be helpful. But what can we do for those who have autism now? So because we have pieces, it just means there's a lot of trial and error, unfortunately, but we do that anyway. And we are the perfect profession as either health coaches or holistic nutrition professionals to be doing trial and error, especially with lifestyle, sleep, food, etc. But we just have to broaden what is being done now. So typically an autism protocol is all about limiting foods and doing brain therapy. And there's nothing wrong with brain therapy. And there may be foods that need to be removed. I wouldn't jump to conclusions, but certainly that may be the case with some of the people that you're working with. But if it's a gut-related issue, it needs gut solutions. Food protocols or removing foods is not a gut protocol. It's not a gut protocol at all. And so we need to understand that. And specifically that specific foods are not the cause. If someone has a food issue, so they have trouble digesting a specific food or foods, that's another sign they have dysbiosis. So the same dysbiosis is causing the issue with foods that may be related also to being a factor in autism. And until we start seeing it that way, we're always going down the wrong rabbit hole because we're going after the food when we should be going after the gut. So some strategies, well, food protocols are difficult as autistic kids tend to be picky eaters. So, start just by introducing new foods. Slowly, maybe get some small amounts into some favorite foods or something like that. Help them find new favorite foods that might be more suitable. And gradually you can wean them away from one and into another. It's very, very difficult, but it's certainly worth it. Probiotics and prebiotics need to be added for sure. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Consider supplements, vitamins, minerals, things like that, EFAs. Colostrum for the gut lining, or glutamine if colostrum is not tolerated, or marine collagen. All of these can be very helpful for repair. In terms of carbohydrates, there's only a subset of those with autism that have poor carbohydrate metabolism. There's been studies of gluten-free, casein-free diets on children with autism, and they've all been inconclusive. So there's no smoking gun there. And the irony is that wheat and other grains and dairy all feed bifidus bacteria that produces butyrate. So again, if they can't digest it, they can't digest it. But if they can, then it is something that is worthwhile having in their diet to help the situation. They also did a study of 80 children and found increasing vitamins and minerals was helpful for symptoms. And then there's the GAPS diet. So it only helps some, and the question is why? It could be the group it's helping is those who have the poor carbohydrate metabolism because they remove the grains and the legumes and such. But they're missing the bacteria that allows them to metabolize it, and this diet doesn't help them with that. And when I say they're missing the bacteria, it doesn't mean they don't have any. They don't have enough. There's a big difference. If they don't have enough, that means if they get fed, they might have more. It's tricky. It's very tricky. However, it is a nutrient-dense diet, which may be helpful for all children, and it includes fermented foods, which of course is going to help gut function. The keto diet, so again, they've looked at it, and a high-fat diet may also be helpful for autistic children who have poor carbohydrate metabolism, especially if they're prone to seizures, because the keto diet helps those who have epilepsy, helps them with their seizures. And one of the strategies that I heard, or theories that I heard, was that the reason they have the seizures is because of they can't get carbohydrates into the brain for energy. And instead, when they go on the keto diet, the fat ends up being the energy that they can use to get into the brain, if that makes any sense at all. When they studied autistic children for the keto diet, it helped 18 of 30 children. And I just said that. So it may only be beneficial for some, but again, this is a trial and error approach, right? So all of these below can be helpful. Bone broth, of course, very soothing, very nourishing. Kefir, milk kefir if tolerated. If not, then coconut kefir, and I have a little more to say about that in a second. Grapefruit seed extract in a pill form only, because there's no way any child would ever want those drops. Garlic, same thing. Cinnamon oil is one that's really, really antimicrobial, and if they like cinnamon, this might be something you could easily get into them. So you'd have to play with the antimicrobials, but they need something to allow bacteria, good bacteria, their own residential, to have some type of advantage. You want to do other fermented foods, which are also antimicrobial. So is colostrum. Aloe vera is fabulous for the gut, and it's not hard to flavor it and make it palatable. And then, of course, nutrients. So vitamin D deficiency is common in autistics, but again, D goes with A. And a lot of times when they do these studies, they only look at D and they come up with these really high amounts that they probably wouldn't need if they had A with it. It comes with A in food, so that's the way to go. I think cod liver oil is best. All vitamins and minerals are essential for gut health, so it's not only that they're deficient, often deficient, but your gut doesn't function well without vitamins and minerals as well. And so a nutrient-dense diet is critical. But it may vary in specific foods, and this is where a food journal would come in handy. So if you can pinpoint things that are helpful or not helpful, it's easier to develop what's right for the individual that you're working with. And of course, that is trial and error. In terms of probiotics, they're extremely important because until they have enough of their own, the probiotics are going to have to help them do the job. You need the prebiotics, so you might look for ones with GOS. If GOS is not tolerated, IMO is another type of prebiotic that's better tolerated. And then you can look for the strains that we mentioned, but don't get hung up on strains. We don't know enough to say that they have to be these strains. We just don't know. The Visabiome is also an option. The fermented food, sauerkraut's a great one to hide in foods. It's easy to hide if you've got, berries or any kind of thing that with a strong flavor to it. You don't taste the sauerkraut at all, especially in a smoothie. And then there's this product called cultured coconut, which we've been talking about in the Healthy Gut group in the last few days. So essentially, this is made from kefir grains. It's cultured for 48 hours. And the woman, I talked to her for about an hour yesterday. She had it tested at 7 months. So after it had been produced 7 months later, it had 4 trillion strains, or 4 trillion CFUs of bacteria. There's about 40 odd strains in there. It's weird because they're not necessarily the same strains that are in kefir, milk kefir, even though this is made from milk kefir grains. So that's just a fermentation thing. It just shows you that different things will ferment differently depending on what they are. And the reason I'm mentioning it, because if the Visabiome at 450 billion is showing a difference, imagine what 4 trillion would do. And in order to get the 4 trillion, it's about 1 tablespoon. And again, she didn't have it tested at the beginning, so we don't know if it evolved to 4 trillion or they were always there. That we don't know. But whatever, it's still a heck of a lot. To get to 4 trillion, it had to be quite high even at the beginning. And because it's in a tablespoon, and you can start really small, you could do like half a teaspoon, which I would highly recommend, and then build up. It's a very easy thing to get into someone who's a picky eater, because you could slide that into just about anything. So I'm mentioning that it's available only in certain parts of Canada, the Maritimes. It's in Ontario now. There's some stores in Manitoba and Alberta. They have they're working on a distribution deal with a guy in BC who would then be able to distribute all across Canada. And they want to go to the States, but they'd have to scale up again. They just scaled up to handle all of Canada. But there is a guy, and the reason I'm mentioning this, because if this works for a client you have, then the parent are not going to mind the cost it would take to get it. And so there's a gentleman in Montreal at a store called Nature Santé, S-A-N-T-E, so Nature Santé. If you go to the Cultured Coconut website and go to where to buy and just look for the Quebec listings, there's about 4 or 5 of them, look for Nature Santé, he will ship it to the US. You're going to pay a lot for delivery, and in the summer months, it comes in a package that, you know, protects it from the heat. And so you pay for that as well. And it ends up being over double the cost of the actual product by the time it's shipped. That's even in Canada. But for this particular situation, it'd be worth it. And it has a long shelf life. And if you're only giving them a teaspoon or something, that's going to last a while. Once it's opened, it has like 2 months shelf life. So it's well worthwhile. So I'm mentioning that because I'm thinking in this particular case, more is more. All right. So when you're working with a client, one of the things you want to ask is, are the issues of the client due to continued exposure to, say, negative bacteria metabolites or toxins in the environment? Or, you know, these are things that you need to go through with each client. And when you talk about this and interventions for these things, this is what's going to possibly help to see what symptoms can be improved. And then the other question then is, are there permanent brain alterations? And if this is the case, they may not be able to help any interventions we come up with, or it's a really long-term strategy. But the good news is the brain is more resilient than we thought, so there's no reason not to try any of these steps. And that's the end of my presentation. So I'm coming back to you guys now. All right. So Luana's saying, I want to try that coconut kefir for her son. I really strongly. Sandra's going, I think that's what you're doing, Sandra. Okay, do you have any questions? I know that was a lot of technical stuff, but I was trying to create a picture with regard to the gut. And hopefully, I mean, it's not a dissimilar story to other conditions, but I think that it's one where I don't think, I mean, people are talking about gut, but they're not really giving it enough attention. So you're very quiet. Why are you guys so quiet tonight? Please tell me you're still here. Are you still here? Please stop having me talk to myself. Oh, there we go. Thank you, Jane. Oh. So very interesting. Thank you. I missed the first 15 minutes. Am I able to watch it later? Yeah, the PowerPoint, I did send out a link today with the PowerPoint, but I will send it out again with the replay. Kat says still here. Karen says, sounds similar to Donna Eden's body ecology. It's Donna Gates, actually. Body ecology diet. She worked, unless she changed her last name. She works with a lot of autistic. She could have got married. I don't know. But her kefir is not as comprehensive as milk kefir is. She doesn't make it from the milk kefir grains. So, and in comparison to this coconut, cultured coconut, yeah, there's no comparison. But yeah, I mean, I would hope she would be doing that because, you know, gut is her specialty. Luana says, I think goat milk would be good too. Yes, it would. Nikki says, Donagane also has coconut kefir fermented drink and has a kefir kit plus instructions. Yeah, but I don't think it has, that's been around for quite some time. And it doesn't have the number of I know somebody who's certified by Donna Gates and has been selling that kefir at the Waldorf market for a number of years, or at least she was. We talked about this. It's not the same. It's not that it's bad. Don't get me wrong. It's not that it's not helpful. But if you really want to up it, you got to go a little more hardcore. So either milk kefir grains or this cultured coconut, especially if they have a dairy issue. Naoma says, great information. Thank you. Karen says, right. Donna Eden is the energy medicine one. Okay. Any questions? I'll take a sip of water. I know that went on a little bit longer. Katrina says, I have lived with epilepsy my whole life, and others with combination of epilepsy and autism, as well as neurological issues. I have always recommended the coconut options and studied this area in plant diversity in university. Very good. Orly says she's still at the Waldorf every other week. Yes, Olga. She actually had her speak at a conference many, many years ago. We had her, and we had someone who was the Weston A. Price Foundation, and did a more traditional ferment presentation. It's very good, both of them. Can you repeat the probiotics you mentioned? It was cultured coconut. I did, when I send out the replay, the link to their website will be there. I had a teacher who worked with autistic kids, and the really picky eaters, she would cut open, I love this, cut open French fries and sprinkle in green powder or whatever she needed the kids to eat. That's a great idea. But that's what you have to do. You have to be creative. Lori says, check out Nemechek protocol. He is using inulin and olive oil to treat autistic children. Your propionate slide created a light bulb to understand why, but not all are responding well to it as per your gut diversity note. And this is the most important thing, if you take nothing else from this presentation, is that there is no one protocol for all children with autism. This does not, just like there's no one protocol for all people for anything, but specifically this one, because they have so many people who fall under the diagnosis of the spectrum disorder, but they're all very, very, very different. The way it plays out, there is going to be no one protocol. So, and I think we're capable of handling that concept and working with the person that we're working with, and not, looking for something that works for everyone, right? I think we're used to that concept now. Nikki says CBD oil has been shown to be helpful for redundant epilepsy. Check Canadian Charlotte's Web CBD oil for epilepsy. Luana is asking, and this is a fabulous question, Luana. What do I know about fecal transplants for autism? Not a lot. I think it would be a viable option. And the reason I say that is because when they've gone beyond colitis for fecal transplants, and they're looking at it very, very seriously in other areas. So there's a lot of research going on in this, but it has been shown to be helpful with other conditions. The question is, who donates the fecal? Because you have to make sure that they aren't having something that is related to gut bacteria, an issue, a health issue, that you're translating into the new person. And I think I've given this example before, where a daughter donated to a father, because they often go within families, and the daughter had an anxiety disorder, and while the fecal transplant helped the father for his condition, he developed an anxiety disorder, because we know that the gut and brain are connected, and anxiety has a big gut connection. So I do think that fecal transplants in theory are a fantastic idea. You just got to get good quality feces. And so that's, I think, what they're looking at and what they might be able to do. Um, any other questions? Okay, I think we're good. It's hard to say. I know there's a time delay. I got to stop rocking in my chair. I know there's a time delay. So, oh, Katrina says, although I printed the slides, the quiz was not present. It's there now. I just posted it around 5:30 tonight. Yeah, I hadn't posted it when I sent out the, what do you call it? The email this morning. Okay. All right. Well, it looks like everybody, I think, is good. As I said, I'm sending out the replay, and everything will be there, including the link to this guy who can ship you the cultured coconut if you're interested. And hopefully we will see you next time. Right now, barring any unforeseen changes, is probably next month is going to be on Lyme disease, because that's what's been requested. So that'll be an interesting one too. All right. Good night, everyone. Have a good evening.